I don't see anything wrong with just shipping a monolith to the cloud, but probably if they're coming to you to go to the cloud, there is something there that is not working 100%. Starting to kind of break that down and figure out exactly which part of that monolith is not working for them, I think it's really important.
Today we've got Luciano on, and we're going to be talking through serverless architecture. And I think there's going to be a load of really good insights. So first, do you want to introduce yourself?
Of course. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Sam. It's an honor and a pleasure. So thanks again for inviting me to the show. So my name is Luciano, and I am a senior architect for a company called Fortiorem. What we do is basically a consulting company trying to help companies to move to AWS, to adopt serverless technologies, and effectively to excel with the cloud journey. And myself, I've been most of my background has been mostly as a full stack developer. And I think slowly in the last 5 years, I've been moving more and more into cloud and cloud architectures. But still, I like to code day to day and build projects and write pretty much all the stack end to end, from the infrastructure as code, the application code, thinking about the architectures and how to make them scalable. People might recognize me because I wrote a book in the space of Node.js called Node.js Design Patterns, together with Mario Casciaro.
With your background and your full stack kind of nature, it's going to be really good to see kind of how you approach software architecture. And I think that's the first thing I want to kind of ask you is, like, when you first come across a project, it might be a client project, it might be that your manager comes to a project, it might just be a new feature that you're adding to an existing project. Kind of, how do you break that down into like steps, and how do you actually implement like the architecture?
That's a really interesting question. I think it's a little bit challenging to try to answer in absolute, because I think every project is it's very different, and it's not just about the project. Sometimes I find that when you have to go to the cloud and when you have to adopt serverless, there is a significant shift in the way of working. So when you're working with a customer and they have their own development team, I think it's important to really start by understanding, where are they right now in this cloud journey? Are they still thinking about doing things on premise and delivering monoliths and releasing maybe once a month, which is something that we actually still see pretty often these days, surprisingly. So bringing them to adopting serverless is not something that they will be able to do like overnight. I think there is a journey where you have to incrementally help them to get there. So that might influence the way you build the project, trying to figure out what is the starting point, what is the goal here, and how do we get there in such a way that then the team that will need to maintain the solution long term is comfortable doing all of that stuff. So I know it's a very vague answer. I'm kind of avoiding the answer in a way, but I think it's important to remark that there is like no one fit all solution. You cannot just say I'm going to use serverless for every project and be successful. I'm quite convinced about this, even though I would like to say yes, just use serverless, it's going to be fine. So yeah, that's probably the first step. I think once you have a feeling for that, I think you can find different degrees of serverless adoption. What I find is that when you have teams that are comfortable enough with AWS and they do understand event-driven architectures, it is pretty easy to do that switch. And at that point, you can focus mostly on what is the actual feature or what is the actual project, what are the key, I guess, requirements that you need to satisfy in terms of functionality, in terms of non-functional stuff like, performance, security, scalability. And then I think it's very important to nail those down from the very beginning, like really understand, why are we doing this project? Why are we doing this migration? What are the goals? And what, like, if we are making an investment, what do we expect to get back from this investment? And I think that needs to drive the whole design and architecture and priorities for different features and so on. So this is kind of the best, I guess, case scenario when you have a team that is already very close to the end state of the journey. But like everything else in between, you need to figure out how to incrementally get there. And I think it's not that bad if you say, I'm not just going to use serverless straight away, because I think the team there is not ready. Maybe you just do a lift and shift migration, which sounds bad. And most of the time it doesn't give you most of the benefits you're looking for in the cloud. It just gives you maybe even extra cost and extra complexity. But I think it's the first step to be in the cloud. And if you have a good plan to start continuing the journey from there and start to introduce more practices, like start to create, even a simple integration using Lambda, I think that's already unlocking some of the capabilities there and helping the team to understand a different way of working, a different mindset. So sorry for the long answer, but I think it's important to, I don't know, not to give like a one size fits all answer to this.
Yeah, I think that's really good because, yeah, there is never going to be a perfect answer. There's always going to be complexities and nuances and different requirements. Like, it's very different starting a project with a brand new startup that has nothing versus starting with an enterprise customer who has a load of existing on-premise or EC2 based infrastructure, but also they might also have a lot of extra security requirements or other like non-functional requirements around their application, which you need to take into consideration. One of your other points was like really understanding where the development team of the customer is at. So in terms of that, like if you approach a new customer and they've never used AWS and serverless, do you have an approach for how to upskill them, or is it like self-taught? Do you have any things that you would suggest that they focus on to kind of upskill from like the traditional, even on-prem architecture to AWS and then into serverless?
Yeah, I think it depends on the customer and the budget they have and the type of project that they want to build. But one approach that we really like to push at Fortium is the approach where I like to think about ourselves like a different kind of consultancy company, where I think the two extremes are you either build the entire project for them and then throw it over the fence and like good luck, or you just say, I'm just going to draw an architecture for you and then you go and figure it out. I think these are the two extremes. I think we sit somewhere in the middle and we try to kind of accompany the customer along all the journey. So that basically means we might start with an assessment where we say, okay, why are you thinking to invest in this project? What do you want to achieve? Okay, once that's clarified, let's try to draw together an architecture and figure out, okay, do you think this architecture is going to satisfy your needs? And then there is kind of that gap assessment, like who is the team that needs to work on this long term? Can we work with them and try to figure out step by step how to go from zero to the complete project and then hand it over? But the handover is not really something that is like a black or white kind of thing. It's more, you have been already working on this project, so it's just, you should be already good to go. Just be aware that we'll be there to help you out, but now it's on you to keep maintaining this. So with that approach, I think there is a lot of things that you can do in terms of if you see a skill gap, you can easily address it with, for instance, like a pairing session. Something that we do a lot is not just split tasks among our people from Fortium and the people in the technical team of the company, but we literally create sessions where we work together, we do pair programming, we do code reviews, so all the best practice and always working as if it was like one big team. And I think that helps a lot to, on our side, to get all the business domain knowledge that we might not have from the outside. And on the customer side, we might have a lot of AWS skills to give them and make it easier for them to understand all the new paradigms that you have to deal with when using AWS. There are another couple of things that we have built in the last couple of years, which are what we call accelerator programs. So these are almost like workshops or training programs that we can do to basically try to cover the basics. Sometimes we work with customers that they haven't used AWS at all, so that they have no idea where to start. And I think it's important to start with the right foot and explore things like, how do you do your landing zone? What does that even mean? How do you do proper security? What is IAM? What is a policy? And make sure that the people working on the project are comfortable enough with all these concepts before they are actually building stuff on AWS.
That's really a really nice way of doing it, and it's a way I've seen a couple of other companies and consultancies do it, training them by building the product that they're going to be working on. But yeah, obviously sometimes you do need that little boost at the start so that they can understand what's really going on throughout the project. In terms of like designing architecture, so we'll move on to some of the questions now, like how do you plan for future scale when kind of architecting a platform? Do you try and design an architecture that you know will fit the current requirements, but in the future, say that the product goes really well and triples or 10x's its customer base, you know, it works now, but in the future we're going to need to re-architect? Or do you design it, kind of prematurely optimize it because you think it might scale up to there? Or is there some other approach you take to kind of designing your architecture?
That's a good question. Again, I don't really know if there is an absolute answer. Sorry if it seems like I'm dodging all the questions. But I think there might be techniques that are common enough in the industry. Like if you think about evolutionary designs, thinking with that mindset where everything you build, there is so much unknown going forward that the only thing you can do is basically to try to make sure that what you build can be changed over time. That means that the project is always evolving, so you always need, from a business perspective, to think about this is like an ongoing investment, and hopefully the return is bigger than the investment over time. But the project is never done as such. Like it's never perfectly, indefinitely scalable, or it's going to have all the features forever. I think you need to think about most of the cloud projects as something like that, where it's always evolving. It's like its own organism, and you are feeding it and try to figure out, okay, what is it missing and what do we need to do better to make sure it keeps improving and getting better and satisfy whatever is the business need that needs to satisfy. So with serverless, I find that it is actually generally somewhat easier because serverless pushes you to build more composable architectures, more kind of event-driven architectures. So I think it's easier to keep things more isolated in terms of business domains. It's easier to swap things out. So for instance, you might realize, okay, we built this solution with Lambda, and then we realize, okay, this thing is spinning up thousands of Lambdas and we are running out of concurrency, which is something that actually I've seen happening quite often, especially when you use Lambda aggressively for building APIs. And one solution there could be, okay, either you call AWS and you say, can you increase my quota, or you move to something like Fargate. And I think that switch from, for instance, Lambda to Fargate with serverless is not that complicated, and you can incrementally move parts of the API. Like you don't need to move everything overnight. You can incrementally move things out and figure out exactly what is the design that's going to help you through the next phase of growth. So I like to think about like phases of growth and like that consistent change, and then building architectures that can be somehow evolved over time. Like I think they are never done in a way. When the project is successful, there is always something new coming up, and you need to be ready to figure out, okay, like what's coming up next? What do we need to do to adapt to the next set of requirements?
That's really good. One of the really good benefits of serverless is, being able to just like swap in things as you need them and as the requirements change, and also having a more kind of incremental approach with serverless. That's like kind of not a necessity. You can always try and go for like waterfall approach with a serverless project, but most of the time, at least in the projects I've worked on and the clients I've worked with, it tends to be that like that incremental approach is a lot easier to adopt with serverless than with more traditional architecture. So here's one of the kind of more controversial topics and questions that I get asked a lot about: local testing and development. So obviously with serverless, it's very different in terms of the development lifecycle and also the testing compared to a more traditional thing where you've got your nodes server running locally and you can test everything locally. What's your approach or your thoughts on local testing and development within the context of like a serverless architecture?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that we have been debating internally a lot. We've been trying, I think, a bunch of different approaches, and I don't know if there is one that makes me fully satisfied, because there is always a little bit of, I don't know, making hard trade-off. I think certain approaches will give you certain trade-off and you might be happy with them at a certain point, and then you miss something else and you need to try something else. So I think overall testing with serverless is like another journey, and there are so many different things that you can do, and probably you should be having a healthy mix of approaches to be sure that you are actually testing things correctly. The local testing story, I find it very variable depending on the tooling you use. I think, for instance, if you use SAM with the latest development, I think it's not that bad. You can easily simulate an API gateway locally. You can simulate Lambdas running in a container that is somewhat closer to the real environment that you get on AWS. You can easily package and do that kind of auto reload approach where if you change something in the code, automatically kind of refreshes your local environment. But then there is a limit at some point when you start to write actual useful cloud code where you integrate with other resources on AWS. I think that's where that model easily breaks down. Like if you're building just a simple Hello World API, fine, everything is amazing. When you start to call, I don't know, SNS, SQS, and a bunch of other services, DynamoDB, some of them you can kind of simulate them locally, but the more further you go in the project development, the harder it gets to properly simulate everything, right? You're never gonna have an entire AWS running in your own machine, and if you do, it's probably gonna be some kind of trimmed down version that is not gonna have feature parity, and possibly is gonna also have things that are implemented differently, and then they might trip you up when you go to production. There are other approaches that I've seen, and I think, again, you can add them on top of your testing approach when the local testing is not enough anymore. For instance, if you use SAM, again, you can do some kind of live sync that it doesn't sync your own local machine, but actually pushes the new code directly into an AWS account. So when you test, you are actually testing against a set of AWS resources that are real running in AWS. A bit painful to set up, takes a little bit longer to see changes, but then what you are testing gives you more confidence that is actually what you're going to get if you ship to production. Then we can also talk about the other types of tests, not just like local testing and changing things and see what happens, but actually writing unit test, integration test, end-to-end test, and all that kind of stuff that I think you should be having before you just click deploy to production, just to give you the confidence that you're not going to break production.
That's really nice, like seeing that you've kind of described breaking it into like different levels of testing. So you've got obviously the unit testing, like the code level testing, and you've got the option for local testing with like SAM or with serverless framework. You can mock out multiple services, and then kind of once that hits its limit, which inevitably it will do, like we're never going to be running EventBridge locally. We're never going to be running like some of the proprietary services. Like imagine trying to run like these new AI bedrock models locally. I don't think there's going to be very many mocks for those anytime soon. But once you hit those limits, it's then like, can you run the code locally but use deployed resources? And then after that, it's okay, having everything deployed and being able to test against fully deployed architecture. And like, you don't have to use every step, I guess. It gets slower, but gets more resilient and more realistic as you move along that scale. I think a lot of companies struggle to adapt to that kind of variable testing methodologies. So yeah, one of the other things you mentioned earlier was about kind of not always necessarily jumping straight into, okay, everything has to be serverless. So kind of when you approach a customer that might have an existing tech stack, kind of how do you best approach that and work with them? You've got an on-prem client, and ideally you think this workload would actually do really well in serverless. Do you jump straight there, or is there a different process that you guys like to take?
And again, I think you need to really understand the customer. What are the goals? What they want to achieve? Why are they coming to you in the first place, right? That they probably figure out that there is something that they want to do and they cannot do it by themselves. So I think that's kind of one of the key points of the conversation. I don't see anything wrong with just shipping a monolith to the cloud if that works perfectly for your business, but probably if they're coming to you to go to the cloud, there is something there that is not working 100% well. So starting to kind of break that down and figure out exactly which part of that monolith is not working for them, I think it's really important. One mistake will be, okay, let's just rewrite everything in serverless, but that's gonna realistically be a failed project because it might take multiple years and you are gonna see the benefits only at the very end if you get there at all. So the risk is that in between the business realize we have invested so much money that this doesn't make sense anymore, we are not seeing a return, and even kill the project before it sees the light. So trying to find that incremental approach is always probably more challenging strategy, but it's I think it gives you more chances to succeed in the end. Because one thing would be, okay, let's just keep the entire monolith, but maybe, I don't know, the part that is not working is the payment gateway for whatever reason. Maybe it's too coupled, and maybe you need to integrate new payment gateways, and it's becoming harder and harder to do that. Maybe what you can do is, okay, let's move the entire monolith to the cloud, and then you start to break down that monolith only by removing the parts that you want to replace first, and rewrite them with more kind of serverless technologies, and try to figure out that hybrid approach that maybe might look a little bit messy from the outside, but it's the beginning of that transition from one type of architecture to another type. And if everything works in the long term, doesn't look nice, but maybe it's functional for the business even to have that weird mix of like a big monolith and just a few serverless things rotating around it. So that could be one approach. Again, I don't see many customers needing to do this kind of big bang. Sometimes it happens that what they have is so complex. We had one time a customer that had lots of stuff like in COBOL or in TCOL. So sometimes it happens to have this kind of weird customers where they have, I don't know, something that is built in such a way that it's very hard even to bring to the cloud. But at the end of the day, if it's running on premises in a machine, you can always package it in a EC2 instance and run it that way as a first step, and then figure it out from there. How do you start to decouple something and rewrite it as you go?
I think that approach of taking like small chunks at a time is, it's kind of becoming a very common approach in the migration, whether it is migrating from on-premise to the cloud, or if it's migrating from like EC2 to serverless. Kind of don't try and change it all in one go. Take little bits at a time, run them in parallel. And I've worked with one of my clients, and they have most of their infrastructure running in a set of EC2s in a cluster, and that runs their core infrastructure is running on that, and the core business. But then every new feature, anytime there's a big feature that breaks or needs a big rewrite, they just rewrite that in Lambda. And maybe in 2 or 3 years, eventually, everything will have been rewritten into serverless. But at the moment, it works quite well having that kind of balance of the speed and flexibility of Lambda, but with the efficiency and without having to have invested all of that time to rewrite that core infrastructure and core code. So now we have the architecture design challenge, and this is going to be an application that is fictitious, but I want you to kind of look through this introduction and description and requirements and kind of tell me what jumps out at you. Is there anything you think is really important to note? Any kind of patterns that you instantly think, oh, for that feature, here's a pattern? And kind of what would be the next steps to move from here's a set of requirements to let's start refining this and working towards an actual architecture. So this is a application, and what it's going to do is it's going to be similar to Zapier, where you can trigger it using different triggers, and it's going to be used for AI document processing. So you're going to use just an API, so you're not trying to build your own custom AI. So you could be using ChatGPT, you could be using one of the Bedrock models, and kind of the core feature is that you can upload a document and then give it a prompt. So it could be a research paper, and you give it the command to write a 500-word summary of the key points of this research paper. What that will do is it will generate the summary and also store that so that later you can re-access that same query. The second feature is that you can then ask follow-up questions. So after it's generated the summary, you could say, like, what was the neural architecture for this research paper, for example. Now here's where it becomes a little bit more technically interesting. As well as just being able to manually upload a file and ask directly on the website. You want to have a way that they can bulk upload a set of files, and you can then attach different rules to where they've uploaded it. For example, they could have a folder called Summarize, and every PDF that they upload onto this Summarize folder gets triggered, and they send that to the AI with a predefined Summarize command for that folder. Once that's finished processing, you then get a notification to a set of users. Once you've got all these documents and you've been using it and your team has been using it, there's a UI where you can look through all of the documents that have been processed in the past. You can then filter down on things like whether it was a custom command, so if someone had just uploaded it and typed their own command, or if it used that kind of Zapier-esque trigger. And then also like who created it and the date of processing. You can then also do some free text search. You can say, oh, I've got this research paper, let's find out if anyone else has processed this before. Finally, a UI that's locked behind some sort of login. So you can restrict certain people from viewing, certain people from uploading or asking questions. And then you've got some sort of multi-tenant organization structure so that people can be in a team together. So, what are your initial thoughts?
That's really seems like a really ambitious startup type of project, but it's really interesting. I think there is a lot we can talk about here. One thing, like if this was a real project with a real company, one thing that I would like to understand a little bit more just before jumping into the technicalities, like really understanding the business, like which kind of customers do you have? Do you have a specific market segment that is like the most important? Because I think sometimes those answers can highlight things in the technical spec that are not necessarily obvious for the feature list. I don't know, maybe if this is like legal stuff or medical stuff, you might want to be extremely careful about how do you store the data, making sure things are encrypted, making sure there is no private information being stored, I don't know, places where it doesn't need to be. But probably we have to assume that this is kind of very open, or do you want to give me more details in that sense?
So that's an interesting point that no one's brought up before. So let's go with that this is a legal firm, because that brings up a whole new bunch of kind of sub requirements. And this is kind of a really good point. Like often when you get a feature or you get a project with some requirements, all the requirements aren't there, or all the details aren't there. So if we go with it's a law firm and it's used for processing legal documents, kind of does that then bring on other questions, or how does that affect kind of the architecture you might go with?
And it's still multi-tenant in a way that this is like a startup selling to law firms, or we are building a product for one specific law firm?
Let's go with a startup selling to law firms.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, that makes sense. So I think now I don't know exactly like all the regulation, but I think there is definitely a point to keep there in mind that every data we store, we want to be extremely careful with assessing whether this is sensitive, this is something that legally we need to do in a certain way or not. So something just worth keeping in mind as we go through every single feature, just given the context. Okay, so where do we start? Let's try to think about the different like high-level components of this application. There is one part that is basically user and tenant management. So making sure that you can log in, you can access your own tenant, and that things are kept separated, like tenants are not really exchanging data unless they are supposed to. So that all of that stuff is definitely one component we need to think about. Then there is another component which is probably the upload part, like how do we make it easier for people to, once they are logged in, to upload documents, because that's the beginning of the next feature where basically a document can trigger something else. And then I think there is another part which is the notification. So there is the processing of the document, and then at the end there is the notification as well. And I am assuming this is a web product, so we can have like a web UI hosted somewhere, and well, on AWS of course, but there will be a web UI, and that's in the browser, you log in and you do all these steps. Okay, what do we do next? So at this point we kind of have a, not necessarily like domains, like business domains, but we can start to break down into major areas and maybe start to think about how do we implement the different parts. So for the login side, I will try to do the authentication piece using something like Cognito or even some third-party provider like Okta or OutZero, just because there is significant complexity there that you don't want to rebuild all of that yourself when you can use a service. That should be flexible enough to give us the opportunity to do all the different login types, let's say OIDC, but also to be able to say, well, different tenants can configure their own OIDC provider. Maybe they use, I don't know, at the company level, they use Azure on one side, Google on another company, and you want to be able to integrate different ones into their own tenants. So that should be possible with Cognito. I'm not going to say it's simple, but it's something we have done. There are other tricks there to do at the business logic level to make sure you run things respecting the same tenant, but that's more of an implementation detail that if we have extra time, we can discuss later. But that should cover all the login stuff. Then we have the document upload. Probably S3 is going to be a major component there. I think there might be some discussions in terms of how do you do the front end. Probably we would want to use pre-signed URLs because we don't really know in advance how big the files are, and we don't want to, I guess if we want to keep it simple, probably pre-signed URLs are gonna take us a long way. What else? We might use some encryption there. I don't know if it could be a requirement. Maybe some customers will want to use their own encryption keys. Maybe we can consider that. Even though if they do that, then we'll need to see exactly how that is going to affect the processing part of the project, right? Because if we cannot read the content, we cannot run automation on that content. So that's maybe something to revisit a little bit. Then for the triggering part, probably there are a couple of things to be considered there, because I think we need some kind of data storage as well, more as a application data. For instance, you mentioned that there are, as a tenant, I could have configured different folders. Actually, I don't even know if that's at the tenant level or is at the user level, but maybe let's assume for now it's at the tenant level for simplicity. So as an organization, you configure different folders and you can upload into different folders to trigger different automations, right? So probably we need to have all of that information stored somewhere in advance, and that's always the case where you start to debating, should we go for SQL or should we go for DynamoDB? And I never have like a straight answer to that question. If I have a feeling that there might be so many access patterns and the data needs to be queried in a bunch of different ways, and we are not able to anticipate all of that upfront, which for a startup is generally very common. So sometimes I prefer to go to SQL just to, I guess, remove a concern there and keep things a little bit more flexible. Okay, but let's just say DynamoDB for now because it's easier to create tables and stuff. So you're probably gonna have a table where you try to store, you need to map a tenant, a folder, and then some kind of ID for a specific kind of automation, I guess. Now, those automation, maybe that's something that we need to define a little bit better in terms of requirements. Can it be anything?
Let's go with, just for now, to keep it simple, it's just a text prompt that you can say, this folder, here is the prompt that I want to automate.
Okay, so you can say, you can predefine a prompt basically. So if the folder is like summary, there is already a baked in prompt that is something like summarize this document in 500 words, something like that, right? Okay, so in our database, we need to keep track of the tenant, the folder name, and the prompt that is triggered when an upload is completed in that folder, right? Okay, at that point, we can probably will need to do some, maybe solutioning a bit too much, but the idea is that we will need to build some API layer where the UI basically knows what you are trying to do. Maybe you are dragging a file into a folder. at the UI level. And what happens behind the scenes is that there is an API that needs to create like a pre-signed URL for that upload to happen in the right folder. We also need to have some kind of feedback loop. So when the upload is complete, we need to know that upload is complete. So we can probably do that with Event Bridge, I don't know. And then based on the bucket, or maybe the prefix on the bucket where that upload was completed, we can trigger the automation. So basically call another API, maybe it's Bedrock, to read the content of the file from S3, send it to Bedrock, and then ask the prompt that was pre-baked. Then we need to take all the answer and somehow save it somewhere else. Now, whether that's another S3 bucket or a DynamoDB record, I guess both could work with different constraints. So we really need to see in detail like how big is going to be the answer and that kind of stuff.
So are there any limitations or anything that would make you decide, oh, actually this needs to be, or this shouldn't be Dynamo, or this shouldn't be S3?
Yeah, I don't remember exactly what are the limits in terms of how much data can you store in a DynamoDB record, but that's definitely something to double check, because if you can expect, I don't know, maybe rather than saying summarize this document, you might say something random like, I don't know, it's the beginning of a story, and you say, well, complete this story, and it needs to be 300 pages, right? Then you will have a lot of data, and therefore maybe storing it in S3 gives you a little bit more flexibility. So probably that's something to consider, even though right now I don't really have a definitive answer. And I guess we still need to store the metadata somewhere in Dynamo, because you still want to retain the correlation between this file was uploaded into this folder, it was processed by the prompt associated to that folder, and that was the result, and that result is stored into S3. So somehow we need to keep track of all this metadata that links all the different steps of the workflow. As I say that, I'm starting to consider maybe there is a use case for step functions, but I don't know, maybe that adds more complexity than actual benefits. But something I will probably try to think through a little bit more, because when there is so much orchestration, I think step functions sometimes can make your life a little bit easier, or at least when you are debugging, it's more obvious what were the steps and the input and output in every single step that led from the beginning of a computation to a specific state in that computation.
I think that's been a really good answer, and I think the fact that you are constantly clarifying things and asking more questions throughout the process, and always making sure to be verifying things that you're basing your decisions on is really important. And it's very easy to go, oh, I just assume that they'll mean this, but often customers don't actually describe their requirements that well. And I think that's a really good point for anyone that's watching, is if someone asks you to build something and gives you a set of requirements, clarify anything that you're not absolutely certain on. Because you don't want to build something and they say, oh, actually, I didn't mean that, I meant something different. And your interpretation means you've got to re-architect, or even worse, rebuild large sections of your infrastructure. So in terms of kind of reaching out to you or like following you, where could people find you and connect with you?
Yeah, I am generally available at loige.co. This is my website where you can find all the other links, and you can find me on X, LinkedIn, Blue Sky, Mastodon, whatever. I'm trying to be in many places as possible, even though I probably use LinkedIn and X the most. But yeah, feel free to reach out in whatever channel, and I'll try to be available for you. I would like to mention, if you give me another second of promotional space, is a podcast that we are running with myself and Owen Shanahy, who is the CTO of Fortiorem, called AWS Bytes, BITES. And it's basically a weekly podcast where we try to share things that we learn about AWS in our day-to-day job.
Yeah, awesome. So yeah, I'll make sure to link all of those underneath the video. And yeah, thank you very much for your time and have a brilliant day.
Thank you so much, Sam. It's been lots of fun, and I hope people found this interesting as much as I did talking to you and thinking about these interesting serverless problems.